Washington, District of Columbia, March 8, 1957. The fluorescent lights of the Atomic Energy Commission building hummed their monotonous song as Frank Willis made his rounds through the empty corridors, his worn leather shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floors. The night shift at one of America's most sensitive government facilities was supposed to be uneventful, a job for men who preferred solitude and the comfort of routine over the chaos of daylight hours. Frank believed his most exciting discovery would be an unlocked filing cabinet or a forgotten coffee pot left burning in some bureaucrat's office. He had no idea that his obsessive attention to detail and his habit of writing down everything he noticed would unravel one of the most damaging Soviet intelligence operations in American history, exposing a spy who had been stealing atomic secrets for nearly a decade. Over the next 18 months, Frank's seemingly insignificant observations would lead federal investigators through a labyrinth of dead drops, coded messages, and midnight meetings that stretched from the marble corridors of Washington to the shadowy streets of New York City, ultimately revealing how close the Soviet Union had come to accessing America's most guarded nuclear secrets. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Frank Willis was 52 years old that March, a man whose life had taken him from the coal mines of West Virginia to the night watch of government buildings in the nation's capital. His hands were calloused from years of manual labor before he found this position, and his eyes had developed the particular alertness that comes from working when the rest of the world sleeps. He had served briefly in the Pacific during World War II. Nothing glamorous, mostly loading supplies and maintaining equipment on a logistics base in the Philippines. The war had taught him the value of paying attention to patterns, of noticing when something was even slightly out of place. The Atomic Energy Commission building on Constitution Avenue was a 7-story structure of limestone and marble, built in the neoclassical style that dominated government architecture in Washington. During the day, it bustled with scientists, administrators, and military personnel working on projects that pushed the boundaries of nuclear technology. At night, it became Frank's domain, a maze of empty offices and locked laboratories that he navigated with the confidence of a man who knew every corner, every hiding spot, every place where someone might try to conceal something they shouldn't. Frank carried a small notebook in his shirt pocket, a habit he had developed during his first week on the job 3 years earlier. He wrote down everything: the time he checked each floor, which lights were left on, which doors were locked or unlocked, any item that seemed out of place. His supervisor had initially mocked this habit, calling it excessive and unnecessary, but Frank continued anyway, finding comfort in the ritual of documentation, in the tangible record of his nightly observations. On that particular March evening, Frank began his shift at 11 in the evening as always. He checked in with the day shift supervisor, reviewed the access logs to see who had entered and exited the building during business hours, and collected the keys to the restricted areas. The building was officially closed to all personnel except those with emergency authorization, and the access logs showed that only 2 people had stayed past 7 in the evening: Dr. Raymond Aldrich from the Nuclear Physics Division and Helen Morrison from the administrative staff. Frank knew both of them by sight. Dr. Aldrich was a tall man in his mid-40s, with thinning grey hair and thick-rimmed glasses that he constantly adjusted. He often worked late, lost in calculations and theoretical models that Frank couldn't begin to understand. Helen Morrison was in her early 30s, efficient and professional, the kind of person who kept the bureaucratic machinery running smoothly while the scientists focused on their research. She usually left by 6 in the evening, but occasionally stayed late when there were reports to finish or files to organize. As Frank made his first round through the building, checking each floor systematically from bottom to top, he noted in his little notebook that Dr. Aldrich's office on the 5th floor was dark and locked, indicating he had left sometime after 7, but before Frank's shift began. Helen Morrison's desk in the 3rd floor administrative section was also clear and dark. Everything appeared normal, exactly as it should be. But then, on his second round at approximately 1:15 in the morning, Frank noticed something peculiar. The door to the file room adjacent to Helen Morrison's desk was slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two, Not enough to be obvious, but enough that Frank's practiced eye caught it immediately. The file room contained personnel records, security clearance documentation, and project assignment files. Nothing classified at the highest levels, but still sensitive enough that it should never be left unsecured. Frank approached the door carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the heavy flashlight on his belt, which doubled as a defensive weapon if needed. He pushed the door open slowly, letting it swing inward while he stood to the side, calling out in a firm voice, "Security! Anyone in there?" No response came. Frank waited 30 seconds, counting silently in his head, then stepped into the doorway and swept his flashlight across the small room. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls, each drawer labeled with codes that Frank had learned to recognize over his years in the building. The room was empty of people, but something was wrong. One of the filing cabinet drawers, marked with the code P7-N, was pulled out about 6 inches, not fully closed as it should be. Frank set his flashlight on a nearby table and pulled out his notebook. He wrote, March 8th, 1:17 a.m. 3rd floor file room door ajar. Cabinet P7-N drawer partially open. He pushed the drawer closed until it clicked into place, checked that it was locked, and made a note to report this to the day shift supervisor. It could have been simple carelessness, someone accessing files during the day and failing to close everything properly. But it nagged at Frank, a small irregularity in the otherwise predictable routine of his nights. 3 nights later, on March 11th, Frank found the same file room door ajar again, at almost exactly the same time, 1:13 in the morning. The same filing cabinet drawer, P7-N, was pulled open 6 inches. This time Frank's instincts sharpened. Once could be carelessness, twice suggested something more deliberate. He examined the door more carefully this time, looking for signs of forced entry. The lock showed no scratches or damage. Whoever was opening this door had a key, which meant it was either someone with authorized access or someone who had obtained a key through other means. Frank checked the access logs from earlier that evening when he started his shift. Helen Morrison had again worked late, signing out at 6:45 in the evening. Dr. Aldrich had left at 7:30. 2 technicians from the maintenance department had been in the building until 8, replacing lighting fixtures on the 2nd floor. Frank wrote everything down in meticulous detail, including the exact position of the drawer, the time of his discovery, and the names of everyone who had been in the building that day. He closed the drawer again, locked the file room door from the outside, using his master key, and continued his rounds. But now he was thinking, analyzing, trying to understand the pattern he was beginning to see. Over the next 2 months, the pattern continued with eerie consistency. Every 3rd or 4th night, always between 1 and 1:30 in the morning, Frank would find the file room door ajar and the same cabinet drawer partially open. He began varying his routine, checking that floor at different times, sometimes at midnight, sometimes at 2 in the morning. But the door and drawer were only disturbed on certain nights, and always when he checked during that narrow window between 1 and 1:30. Frank reported his observations to his supervisor, a man named George Patterson, who managed the security staff for the building. George was a former military police officer, competent but overworked, responsible for security at 3 different government facilities. He listened to Frank's report, with half his attention focused on a stack of paperwork on his desk. George looked up from his papers and said, "You're telling me someone is opening a filing cabinet drawer and not taking anything? No files are missing." Frank shook his head, keeping his voice steady and professional. "I checked with the administrative staff. They did a complete inventory of that cabinet. Everything is accounted for, but someone is accessing it after hours." George leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Could be cleaning staff, could be someone with legitimate access who's working late and forgot to close things properly. Hell, Frank, could be the damn drawer doesn't latch right, and it's sliding open on its own. Frank had tested that theory. The drawer latched firmly and couldn't slide open without someone pulling it. But he simply nodded and said, "Maybe so, but I thought you should know. It's in my reports." George waved his hand dismissively. "Keep documenting it. If something actually goes missing or if you catch someone in the act, let me know. Otherwise, I got bigger problems to deal with." Frank left George's office feeling frustrated but not defeated. He had learned in the coal mines and in the war that sometimes the people above you didn't want to see problems, didn't want complications that might make their own jobs harder. But that didn't change what Frank saw with his own eyes, didn't erase the pattern that was becoming clearer with each passing week. By late May, Frank had documented 23 instances of the file room door being ajar and the cabinet drawer open. He noticed something else too. The incidents occurred more frequently around certain dates. He spread out his notebook entries on the small table in the security office, studying them during his breaks. The pattern wasn't perfectly regular, but there was a rhythm to it. The incidents clustered around the first and third weeks of each month, with fewer occurrences during the second and fourth weeks. Frank wasn't trained in intelligence work or surveillance, but he understood patterns from his years of manual labor. In the coal mines, you learned to recognize the patterns that indicated a tunnel was about to collapse or when equipment was about to fail. The same principle applied here. Someone was accessing that filing cabinet on a schedule for a reason that wasn't immediately obvious. On the night of June 4th, Frank decided to conduct his own small experiment. After his 1 a.m. round, when he discovered the drawer open yet again, he didn't close it immediately. Instead, he positioned himself in a darkened office across the hall with a clear view of the file room door. He settled into a chair behind a desk, turned off his flashlight, and waited in the darkness. 37 minutes later, at approximately 1:42 in the morning, Frank heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. His heart rate increased, adrenaline sharpening his senses. A figure approached the file room, moving with confident familiarity through the dim emergency lighting that illuminated the corridors at night. Frank recognized the silhouette immediately. Helen Morrison, the administrative assistant, who should have left the building hours ago. Helen glanced both ways down the corridor, a quick nervous gesture, then slipped into the file room. Frank could hear the soft metallic sound of the filing cabinet drawer sliding closed, the click of the lock engaging. Helen emerged 15 seconds later, closed the file room door behind her, and walked quickly toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. Her footsteps faded as she descended the stairs, and Frank heard the distant sound of a door opening and closing on a lower floor. Frank remained motionless in the dark office for another 10 minutes, his mind racing. Helen Morrison had a key to the file room, that much was clear. As an administrative assistant with security clearance, she would have legitimate access during business hours. But why was she here in the middle of the night? Why access the filing cabinet and then close it immediately? What was she doing during those 15 seconds in the file room? The next morning, after his shift ended at 7, Frank didn't go straight home to his small apartment in Arlington. Instead, he took the bus to the central office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on Pennsylvania Avenue. The FBI handled counterintelligence and espionage investigations, and Frank had a strong suspicion that what he had witnessed went beyond simple unauthorized access to personnel files. The FBI building was an imposing structure of granite and limestone, designed to project authority and permanence. Frank entered through the main doors, approached the reception desk, and asked to speak with someone about a potential security issue at a government facility. The receptionist, a young woman with carefully styled hair and bright red lipstick, looked at him with barely concealed skepticism. Frank was still wearing his night watchman uniform, rumpled from a full shift, and he knew he looked like exactly what he was, a working-class man who probably didn't belong in the marble halls of federal law enforcement. The receptionist made a phone call, spoke quietly into the receiver, then told Frank to have a seat. 45 minutes later, a man in his mid-30s wearing a dark suit and narrow tie emerged from an elevator and approached Frank. He introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Bradley, his handshake firm but his expression neutral and professional. Bradley said, "I understand you have information about a security concern. Why don't we find somewhere quiet to talk?" They went to a small interview room on the 3rd floor, windowless and plain, containing only a table and 4 chairs. Bradley gestured for Frank to sit, then took the chair across from him, pulling out a small notebook and pen. The similarity to Frank's own note-taking habit wasn't lost on him. Bradley said, "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Frank did exactly that. He spoke for 40 minutes, referring frequently to his own notebook, walking Bradley through every incident he had documented over the past 3 months. He described the pattern of the open drawer, the specific timing of the occurrences, the clustering around certain weeks of the month. He recounted his observations of the previous night. Watching Helen Morrison enter and exit the file room, he provided dates, times, and specific details with the precision of a man who had been recording evidence without initially realizing that's what he was doing. Bradley listened without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across the pages of his notebook. When Frank finished, Bradley looked up and met his eyes directly. Bradley asked, "This cabinet that keeps being accessed, do you know what files it contains?" Frank shook his head. "Just that it's labeled P7-N. The administrative staff said it's personnel files and security clearance documentation." Bradley wrote something else in his notebook, underlining it twice. "And you're certain it was Helen Morrison you saw last night? Could it have been someone else?" Frank's voice was steady and certain. "I've seen her 5 days a week for 3 years. It was her. Same height, same build, same way of moving. I'm sure." Bradley closed his notebook and stood up. "Mr. Willis, I'm going to ask you to wait here for a few minutes. I need to consult with my supervisor. What you've told me is potentially very serious, and we'll need to discuss how to proceed." Frank waited in that small room for nearly 2 hours. He wasn't nervous exactly, but he felt the weight of what he had set in motion. If he was wrong, if there was an innocent explanation for Helen Morrison's nighttime visits to the file room, he would look like a paranoid fool. But if he was right, if this was something genuinely threatening to national security, then his observations might prevent serious damage. When Bradley finally returned, he was accompanied by an older man who introduced himself as Supervisory Special Agent Walter Quinn. Quinn was in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades dealing with the darker aspects of human behavior. He shook Frank's hand with a grip that conveyed both strength and assessment. Quinn settled into a chair and said, "Mr. Willis, Agent Bradley has briefed me on your observations. I want you to understand that what we're about to discuss cannot be shared with anyone. Not your supervisor, not your colleagues, not your family. This conversation is classified and must remain confidential. Do you understand?" Frank nodded. "Yes, sir, I understand." Quinn continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The filing cabinet you've been monitoring, P7-N, contains personnel files for individuals with access to classified nuclear research projects. It includes information about their work assignments, their clearance levels, and in some cases, details about the specific projects they're involved with. In the wrong hands, that information could be used to identify individuals who might be vulnerable to recruitment by hostile intelligence services." The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. He had suspected something significant, but hearing it confirmed made the situation suddenly real and dangerous. Quinn went on, "We're going to need your continued cooperation. We need you to maintain your normal routine, continue documenting everything you observe, but don't change your behavior in any way that might alert Miss Morrison that she's under suspicion. Can you do that?" Frank thought about it for only a moment before answering. "Yes, I can do that. But what are you going to do about her?" Bradley spoke up. "We're going to investigate her very thoroughly. Her background, her contacts, her finances, everywhere she goes outside of work. We'll also place the file room under surveillance to document exactly what she's doing during those nighttime visits. But that takes time to set up properly, and we need you to help us by that time." Frank agreed without hesitation. He returned to his apartment that afternoon, slept fitfully for a few hours, then reported for his regular shift that evening at 11. Everything continued as before, at least on the surface. But now Frank knew that his observations were being taken seriously, that his meticulous documentation had potentially uncovered something that threatened the security of the nation's nuclear program. Over the next 3 weeks, Frank maintained his routine while FBI agents worked behind the scenes. They installed a tiny camera in the file room, concealed in what looked like a fire alarm sensor on the ceiling. They conducted background investigations into Helen Morrison's history, interviewed her neighbors and acquaintances under various pretexts, and surveilled her activities outside of work. They tapped her phone with authorization from a federal judge, and they opened her mail before it reached her apartment, photographing every letter and envelope before carefully resealing them. What they discovered confirmed Frank's suspicions and revealed something far more extensive than a simple case of unauthorized access to personnel files. Helen Morrison Born Helen Kowalski in 1924 in Brooklyn, New York, had seemed like an ideal government employee. She had graduated from secretarial school in 1942, worked in various administrative positions during the war, and joined the Atomic Energy Commission in 1951. Her security clearance investigation had been thorough, revealing nothing concerning in her background. She lived modestly, attended church occasionally, had few close friends, and appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be, a competent, unremarkable administrative assistant. But the FBI surveillance revealed a hidden pattern in her life. Every 2 weeks on Tuesday or Wednesday evenings, Helen would take the bus to a different location in the District of Columbia or nearby Virginia. She never went to the same place twice in succession. Sometimes she went to a movie theater, sometimes to a public library, sometimes to a department store or a diner. She would stay for 30 to 45 minutes, then return home. The FBI agents following her initially thought these outings were innocent. Perhaps Helen was simply lonely and seeking company in public places. But then they noticed something peculiar. During each outing, Helen would briefly make contact with the same man, though never in an obvious way. In the movie theater, he sat 3 rows behind her. At the library, he stood at a bookshelf near where she was reading. At the department store, he browsed in the same section where she was shopping. The man was eventually identified as Viktor Sokolov, officially a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, but almost certainly an intelligence officer with the KGB. The FBI had been aware of Sokolov for several years, suspecting he was involved in espionage activities, but lacking concrete evidence to take action against him beyond routine surveillance. The connection between Helen Morrison and Viktor Sokolov transformed Frank's observations from a potential security issue into a confirmed espionage case. The FBI intensified their investigation, and the surveillance camera in the file room finally revealed what Helen was doing during her nighttime visits. On a Tuesday night in early July, the hidden camera captured Helen entering the file room at 1:19 in the morning, just as Frank had observed numerous times before. She went directly to filing cabinet P7-N, used her key to unlock the drawer, and pulled it open. She reached into her pocket and withdrew what appeared to be several sheets of paper, which she placed back into the files she had presumably removed on a previous visit. She then removed different files from the cabinet, quickly photographed several pages using a tiny camera she produced from her other pocket, and returned the files to their proper places. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. She closed the drawer, locked the cabinet, and left the file room, leaving the door slightly ajar in her haste. The FBI agents reviewing the surveillance footage realized what Helen was doing. She was borrowing files overnight, taking them home to photograph at her leisure, then returning them during her next nighttime visit, while removing new files to repeat the process. The slightly open drawer that Frank had noticed was her signal to her Soviet handler that she had successfully accessed the files and had new material to pass along. The pattern Frank had documented corresponded to her schedule of meetings with Sokolov. She would access the files, photograph them at home, return them and take new ones, then meet with Sokolov to pass the film containing her photographs. The FBI now faced a difficult decision. They could arrest Helen immediately, but that would only capture one relatively low-level operative and might not reveal the full extent of the Soviet intelligence network she was part of. Alternatively, they could continue surveillance and use Helen to identify other participants in the espionage ring, but that meant allowing classified information to continue flowing to the Soviets while they built their case. Supervisory Special Agent Quinn called Frank in for another meeting in mid-July. They met in the same small interview room at the FBI building, and Quinn's expression was grave. Quinn explained the situation carefully. "Mr. Willis, your observations have helped us confirm a serious espionage operation. Helen Morrison has been passing classified information about nuclear research personnel to a Soviet intelligence officer. We believe this has been ongoing for at least 2 years, possibly longer." Frank felt a mix of vindication and concern. He had been right about the pattern, right to trust his instincts. But knowing that classified information had been compromised for years was deeply troubling. Quinn continued, "We need your help with the next phase of this investigation. We're going to allow Helen Morrison to continue her activities for approximately 3 more months. while we identify everyone else involved in this network and document the full scope of the damage. That means you'll continue to observe her nighttime activities, but you cannot take any action that might alert her to our investigation. Can you do that?" Frank understood what was being asked of him. He would have to watch Helen Morrison commit espionage, knowing what she was doing, unable to stop her. It went against every instinct he had developed as a security officer, but he also understood the larger picture, the need to dismantle the entire network rather than just arresting one spy. Frank replied firmly, "I can do it. I'll keep documenting everything, same as I've been doing. She won't know anything has changed." The next 3 months were among the most difficult of Frank's life. Every time he found the file room door ajar, every time he saw Helen Morrison's silhouette moving through the darkened building, he had to suppress the urge to confront her, to demand answers, to put an end to her betrayal. But he maintained his role, continued his meticulous documentation, and provided the FBI with detailed reports of every incident. During this period, the FBI's investigation expanded dramatically. They identified 3 other individuals who were part of the same Soviet espionage network, including a physicist at another government laboratory and a State Department translator. They documented dozens of meetings between these individuals and various Soviet intelligence officers. They traced the flow of information from Helen's photographs through a series of dead drops and intermediaries until it reached the Soviet embassy and presumably was transmitted to Moscow. The FBI also discovered something that explained why Helen Morrison had been recruited and why she had agreed to betray her country. In 1947, Helen's younger brother, Daniel Kowalski, had been captured by Soviet forces while serving as part of a covert intelligence-gathering mission in Eastern Europe. The Soviets had kept him alive but imprisoned, using him as leverage to recruit Helen. They had approached her in 1953, shortly after she gained access to the Atomic Energy Commission's personnel files, with a simple proposition: provide information about nuclear research personnel, or Daniel would be executed. Helen had been trapped by her love for her brother and her fear for his safety. Every file she photographed, every meeting with Viktor Sokolov, was driven by the desperate hope that her cooperation would keep Daniel alive. The FBI would later learn that Daniel Kowalski had actually died in Soviet custody in 1954, 3 years before Frank Willis first noticed the pattern of the open filing cabinet drawer. Helen had been betraying her country to save a brother who was already dead, manipulated by Soviet intelligence officers who had hidden the truth from her. On October 3, 1957, the FBI simultaneously arrested Helen Morrison and 6 other individuals involved in the Soviet espionage network. The arrests were coordinated to prevent any of the suspects from warning the others. Helen was taken into custody as she arrived for work at the Atomic Energy Commission building, led away in handcuffs while her colleagues watched in shock and confusion. Frank Willis was working his regular night shift when he received the news. Agent Bradley called the security office and asked to speak with him. Bradley's voice over the phone was calm, but carried a note of satisfaction. Bradley said, "Mr. Willis, I wanted to let you know that we executed the arrests this morning. Helen Morrison and 6 others are in custody. None of this would have been possible without your observations and your patience over these past months. You've done your country a significant service." Frank felt relief wash over him, mixed with a strange sadness. He had helped catch a spy, protected national security, potentially prevented nuclear secrets from reaching America's enemies. But he also thought about Helen Morrison, a woman trapped by impossible circumstances, forced to choose between loyalty to her country and love for her brother. There were no simple villains in this story, only complicated people making desperate choices. The case against Helen Morrison and her co-conspirators was prosecuted in federal court under tight security. Many details were classified and not released to the public. Helen cooperated with investigators, providing information about her recruitment, her methods, and the intelligence requirements she had received from her Soviet handlers. In exchange for her cooperation, she received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, rather than the death penalty that could have been applied for espionage during peacetime. Viktor Sokolov and the other Soviet intelligence officers involved in the operation were declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. The Soviet embassy issued strong denials of any espionage activities, as was standard practice, but the evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. The FBI conducted a damage assessment to determine what information had been compromised through Helen's espionage. They concluded that while she had never accessed information about specific nuclear weapons designs or classified research findings, she had provided the Soviets with detailed information about who was working on which projects, their security clearance levels, and in some cases, personal information that could be used to identify vulnerable individuals for future recruitment. The damage was significant but not catastrophic, and immediate steps were taken to enhance security procedures and limit access to personnel files. Frank Willis continued working as a night watchman at the Atomic Energy Commission building for another 8 years until his retirement in 1965. He never sought recognition for his role in exposing the espionage ring, preferring to remain anonymous and continue his quiet life. The FBI awarded him a certificate of appreciation in a private ceremony, and he received a small bonus from his employer, but few people ever knew about his contribution to national security. In interviews conducted years later, after details of the case were declassified, Frank reflected on what had driven him to pay such close attention to a seemingly trivial detail like a partially open filing cabinet drawer. He said that working the night shift had taught him to find meaning in small observations, to recognize that patterns existed even in the most mundane aspects of security work. He credited his years in the coal mines and his military service with teaching him that survival often depended on noticing things that others overlooked. The case became a teaching example within the FBI and other intelligence agencies, illustrating the importance of alert security personnel and the value of systematic documentation. Frank's habit of writing everything down in his small notebook, initially mocked by his supervisor, had created an evidentiary record that proved crucial to the investigation. His patience in observing the pattern over months, rather than jumping to premature conclusions, had allowed the FBI to build a comprehensive case against an entire espionage network. The story of Helen Morrison also became a cautionary tale about the methods Soviet intelligence used to recruit American citizens. The exploitation of family connections, the use of emotional leverage, and the patience to maintain an asset over many years were all characteristic of KGB operations during the Cold War. Helen's tragedy was that she had been manipulated into betraying her country while trying to save a brother who was already beyond saving, a victim of circumstances that were beyond her control or understanding. For Frank Willis, the experience reinforced his belief in the importance of ordinary citizens doing their jobs with diligence and integrity. He was not a trained intelligence officer or a sophisticated investigator. He was a night watchman who paid attention to his surroundings and took his responsibilities seriously. But that commitment to his work, combined with his instinct to trust his observations even when others dismissed them, had made a genuine difference in protecting national security during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The Cold War was defined by grand ideological struggles, nuclear standoffs, and dramatic confrontations between superpowers, but it was also fought in the shadows, in the quiet corridors of government buildings at night, in the small observations of alert security personnel, and in the patient work of investigators piecing together patterns from seemingly insignificant details. Frank Willis's contribution to that struggle was modest in scale but significant in impact, a reminder that vigilance and attention to detail matter in every role, no matter how humble. The filing cabinet drawer that Frank found slightly open on that March night in 1957 had been a signal in an espionage operation, a small oversight by someone working under stress and time pressure. But it had also been a thread that, when pulled carefully and persistently, unraveled a complex web of betrayal and manipulation. Frank had noticed the thread and had the patience and judgment to follow it to its conclusion, asking for help when needed and trusting the process even when progress seemed slow. In the years that followed, Frank occasionally thought about Helen Morrison and wondered what had become of her. He learned that she was released from federal prison in 1969 after serving 12 years of her sentence, her time reduced for good behavior, and continued cooperation with authorities. She lived quietly under a new identity, never speaking publicly about her experiences, and died in 1984 from cancer. Her brother Daniel's remains were eventually returned to the United States in a prisoner exchange in 1963, and he was buried with military honors in a cemetery in New York. The Atomic Energy Commission building where Frank worked underwent significant security upgrades in the wake of the espionage case. Access to personnel files was severely restricted, requiring multiple levels of authorization. The practice of allowing administrative assistants to have after-hours access to sensitive areas was ended. Surveillance systems were enhanced, and security personnel were given additional training in recognizing and reporting suspicious patterns of behavior. Frank retired from his position in 1965 at the age of 60, having served as a night watchman for 12 years. He moved to a small town in Virginia, spent his retirement years working in his garden and visiting with his few close friends. He never sought publicity or acclaim for his role in the espionage case, maintaining the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life. When Frank Willis died in 1978 at the age of 73, his obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his role in exposing a Soviet spy ring. It simply noted that he had been a night watchman for the federal government and was survived by his sister and 3 nieces. Only a handful of people attending his funeral knew that his careful observations and meticulous record-keeping had prevented classified information about America's nuclear program from falling into Soviet hands. The story of Frank Willis and Helen Morrison illustrated a fundamental truth about intelligence and counterintelligence work during the Cold War. Success often depended on ordinary people doing extraordinary work in ordinary circumstances. The grand narratives of espionage often focused on dramatic confrontations and sophisticated technology, but the reality was frequently more mundane. A night watchman noticing a pattern, an administrative assistant trapped by circumstances beyond her control. FBI agents patiently building a case through careful surveillance and documentation. The Cold War produced countless such stories, most of which remain classified or unknown. For every dramatic case that became public knowledge, dozens of quieter operations unfolded in the background, protecting secrets, identifying threats, and maintaining the delicate balance of deterrence that prevented the superpower conflict from escalating into direct military confrontation. Frank Willis never considered himself a hero. He saw himself as a man who had simply done his job with the care and attention it deserved. But in that modest self-assessment lay a profound truth about security and vigilance. The most effective defense against espionage and infiltration comes not from elaborate systems or sophisticated technology alone, but from people at every level taking their responsibilities seriously and trusting their observations even when they seem insignificant. The filing cabinet drawer that Frank found partially open 23 times over 3 months was more than just a security lapse. It was a window into a hidden world of espionage and betrayal, a small crack in the careful facade that Helen Morrison had maintained for years. Frank's recognition of the pattern, his insistence on documenting what he observed, and his willingness to report his concerns, despite initial skepticism from his supervisor, had exposed that crack and allowed investigators to peer through it into the larger network beyond. In the end, the story of how a night watchman noticed a pattern that exposed a Soviet spy was not about dramatic action or violent confrontation. It was about patience, persistence, and the quiet courage of trusting one's instincts. It was about the importance of people like Frank Willis, who worked when others slept, who noticed what others overlooked, and who understood that security was not just a set of rules and procedures, but a commitment to constant vigilance and attention to detail. The lessons of Frank Willis's experience remained relevant long after the Cold War ended. In any organization handling sensitive information, the human element remains both the greatest vulnerability and the strongest defense. Systems can be compromised, technology can be defeated, but alert and conscientious individuals who take their responsibilities seriously provide a layer of security that cannot be easily overcome. Frank Willis spent his life in jobs that others might consider menial or insignificant: coal miner, logistics specialist, night watchman. But through his careful attention to his work and his willingness to trust his observations, he made a contribution to national security that few people ever knew about. His story served as a reminder that important work happens at every level of an organization, and that the people doing that work deserve respect and attention when they raise concerns. The partially open filing cabinet drawer, the small notebook filled with meticulous observations, the patient building of a case over months of surveillance, these were the tools that exposed a Soviet espionage operation and protected America's nuclear secrets during one of the most dangerous periods of the 20th century. They were also testament to the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary work in service of something larger than themselves, even when recognition and reward would never come. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.